Rain fell upon the estate with a quiet persistence, as though the heavens themselves had grown accustomed to mourning what the world had long since forgotten. It traced silver paths down tall windows and gathered in shallow pools along the gravel drive, where carriage wheels had once carved elegant arcs beneath laughter and music. Now only the echo of such grandeur remained, faint as a memory too painful to revisit. Within those walls, beneath dim corridors and wavering candlelight, servants moved like shadows, present yet unseen, their whispers threading through the silence like secrets that dared not rise above a hush. Among them was a woman whom no one named unless necessity demanded it. She was simply the older maid, spoken of with neither cruelty nor kindness, but with a peculiar indifference reserved for those who had ceased to matter. Yet there lingered something about her carriage, an old grace that had not entirely surrendered to time. Even in her plain dress, worn at the cuffs and dulled by years of labor, she carried herself with a restraint that suggested she had once been accustomed to finer silks, to rooms filled with light rather than shadow. At 42, her face bore the quiet testimony of endurance rather than age. Lines had formed, yes, but they were not harsh. They spoke instead of long silences, of words swallowed and tears withheld. Her eyes, though softened by resignation, still held an unsettling depth, like a lake whose surface had stilled, though something restless stirred beneath. Those who glanced too long at her often looked away first, unsettled without knowing why. They said she had come to the estate years ago with no history worth recounting. They said she had asked for nothing, accepted everything, and spoken little. What they did not say, what they did not know, or chose not to remember, was that she had once stood at the threshold of a very different life. That evening, as thunder murmured faintly in the distance, the household prepared for distinguished company. Candles were polished, silver arranged, and every surface made to gleam with the illusion of perfection. The mistress of the estate had insisted upon it, for news had arrived that a nobleman of consequence would soon pass through, one whose presence demanded reverence, even in absence. The older maid worked quietly among the others, her hands steady as she arranged porcelain cups upon a tray. Around her, younger maids exchanged whispers, their voices quick with curiosity. "They say he has traveled abroad for years," one murmured, eyes bright. "A man of fortune and secrets." "A duke, no less," another added, lowering her voice as though the title itself required reverence. "Imagine returning after so long. What stories he must carry." The older maid said nothing. She merely adjusted the placement of a teacup, though her fingers paused, just briefly, before continuing. "Do you think he remembers this place?" the first girl asked. The second laughed softly. "Men like that remember only what pleases them." A third voice, sharper, joined in. "And forget what does not. That is the privilege of rank." A silence followed, thin yet charged, before one of them glanced toward the older maid. "Not that it matters to everyone," she said lightly. "Some people are fortunate to be forgotten entirely." A ripple of quiet amusement passed among them, though it was not entirely unkind. It was, rather, the casual cruelty of youth, thoughtless, fleeting, yet cutting all the same. The older maid inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging something only she could hear. Then she lifted the tray and moved past them, her steps measured, her expression unchanged. Yet as she walked the long corridor toward the drawing-room, the past stirred, not vividly, not cruelly, but with the quiet persistence of something that had never fully died. There had been a time when laughter had followed her, when her name had been spoken with warmth instead of absence. There had been a time when this very estate had not felt like a place of labor, but of promise. And there had been a man, no, a young man then, whose voice had once carried a certainty that seemed unbreakable. "You must trust me," he had said, beneath a sky not unlike this one, though it had held no rain. "No matter what comes, I shall return." She had believed him. Not because she was foolish, as some would later claim, but because there had been nothing in his gaze to suggest deceit. Only conviction. Only something dangerously close to devotion. And then, nothing. No letter. No explanation. Only absence that stretched from days into years, until hope itself had withered into something quieter, something that resembled acceptance but felt more like surrender. By the time the older maid reached the drawing-room, her hands had steadied once more. She set the tray down with practiced care, her movements precise, her presence unobtrusive. No one looked at her. No one ever truly did. Outside, the rain began to soften, its relentless rhythm easing into a gentler hush. The estate seemed to breathe with it, as though preparing for something unseen. Then, from the distant entrance hall, came the unmistakable sound of carriage wheels upon wet gravel. Voices rose. Footsteps quickened. A door opened. "He has arrived," someone whispered. The words traveled through the house like a spark catching dry tinder, igniting curiosity, anticipation, and something sharper, something that lingered dangerously close to expectation. The older maid did not turn at once. She stood very still, her hand resting lightly against the polished wood of the table, as though anchoring herself to the present. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze. Somewhere beyond the corridor, a man stepped across the threshold of the estate, unrecognized, unannounced in truth, and cloaked not only in travel-worn attire, but in something far more deliberate. A disguise. And though no one yet understood it, though no whisper had formed to give shape to the truth, something within the older maid stirred with a sudden, quiet certainty, like the faint echo of a voice she had once known by heart. For the first time in years, her composure faltered, not outwardly, but in the smallest, most fragile way. Her breath caught, and somewhere deep within her, long buried beneath dignity and silence, a single, impossible thought rose unbidden. He has come back. Morning did not arrive with brightness, but with a pale, uncertain light that crept reluctantly through the tall windows, as though the estate itself hesitated to reveal what the night had delivered. The rain had ceased, yet its memory lingered in the damp hush that clung to the walls and softened every sound. Servants gathered earlier than usual, their routines sharpened by curiosity, their whispers less restrained than the night before. He had arrived without ceremony, they said. No crest upon the carriage, no grand announcement, only a solitary traveler whose presence, despite its modesty, unsettled the order of the household. The mistress had received him with courtesy edged in confusion, for though his bearing spoke of refinement, his appearance suggested none of the extravagance expected of a man of rank. The older maid heard all of this in fragments, carried from room to room like drifting ash. She did not seek the information, yet it found her regardless. And with each whispered detail, that quiet certainty within her, fragile, dangerous, pressed more insistently against the boundaries she had long maintained. She first saw him in the morning light. He stood near the far end of the corridor, where the windows cast long, pale reflections upon the polished floor. His coat was simple, darkened by travel, his posture composed but unassuming. Nothing in his outward appearance demanded attention, and yet, there was something in the stillness of him, something deliberate, as though he observed more than he allowed himself to reveal. The younger maids passed him without more than a polite nod, their interest dulled by disappointment. This was no Grand Duke as imagined, no figure of dazzling authority. Only a stranger, it seemed, with quiet eyes and an unreadable expression. Only she did not pass. She paused, not abruptly, not enough to draw notice, but just long enough for her gaze to lift, to meet his for the briefest of moments. And in that instant something shifted. It was not recognition, not yet. It was something subtler, more unsettling, a familiarity that could not be placed, like a melody remembered without its name. She lowered her eyes at once and moved on. Yet she felt it, unmistakably, as she passed. He had been watching her. The day unfolded with an unusual tension, as though the estate had become a stage upon which every movement carried weight. The stranger remained largely silent, speaking only when addressed, his voice measured, courteous, yet marked by a depth that did not escape notice entirely. By afternoon, speculation had begun to take a sharper edge. He observes too much, one footman remarked under his breath. As though measuring the place. And the people within it, another added. But why conceal himself, a maid whispered. If he is truly who they suspect, why not arrive as such? No one answered. Questions, it seemed, were more valuable than truth. It was in the small hours of the evening, when the household's bustle softened into routine, that the first token appeared. The older maid had been tasked with preparing tea in the lesser sitting-room, a quiet space rarely used except by those who preferred solitude to society. She entered with her usual care, placing the tray upon the table, her movements precise and unobtrusive. It was only when she turned to leave that she noticed it. A small object, resting near the edge of the table, as though it had been set there deliberately. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached for it. It was a coin, ordinary in appearance at first glance, yet worn in a manner that suggested it had been carried often, handled with quiet familiarity. Her fingers stilled as she turned it over. There, faint but unmistakable, was a marking she had not seen in decades. Her breath caught. It was nothing remarkable to another eye, only a slight engraving, nearly erased by time. But to her, it was a fragment of something long buried, something she had believed lost beyond recall. No, she murmured, barely audible even to herself. Her hand closed around the coin, as though to hide it from the world, or from the truth it threatened to reveal. You found it then? The voice came from behind her, low and steady. She turned at once. He stood in the doorway. For a moment neither spoke. Then she stepped forward, her composure carefully restored, and extended the coin toward him. Sir, she said, her tone measured, this appears to belong to you. He did not take it immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered upon her face, not boldly, not improperly, but with a quiet intensity that unsettled more than any overt scrutiny could have done. And yet, he said softly, you recognized it. The words struck deeper than they should have. She straightened slightly. It is not my place to recognize anything, sir. Only to return what is misplaced. A faint shadow of something, approval, perhaps, touched his expression. Integrity, he replied. A rare quality. She said nothing. At last, he reached for the coin, his fingers brushing hers in the briefest of contacts. It was nothing. It was everything. She withdrew at once, turning slightly as though to leave. Wait, he said. She paused. Tell me, he continued, his voice quieter now, have you always served here? The question was simple. Too simple. She did not turn back. For many years, sir. And before that? A silence stretched between them. Then, carefully, she answered, before that, I was elsewhere. It was the truth. It was also not. He seemed to accept it, though something in his gaze suggested he understood more than her words allowed. You speak, he said after a moment, as one who has known more than service. A flicker of something, pride, pain, passed through her. All people know more than they show, sir. His lips curved faintly, though not in amusement. No, he said quietly. Not all. Footsteps sounded in the corridor beyond, and with them, voices. Too close. Too soon. She stepped back, lowering her head. If you will excuse me. She moved past him, her composure intact, her pace unhurried. Yet as she entered the corridor, she felt it, the shift. Eyes upon her. Whispers already forming. She was alone with him. For longer than necessary. Did you see how he looked at her? The words followed her, soft yet sharp, weaving themselves into something dangerous. By the time she reached the servants' quarters, the air had changed. Curiosity had become suspicion. Kindness, it seemed, was no longer without consequence. And somewhere behind her, in that quiet room, the stranger remained, holding a coin that was no longer lost. Evening gathered slowly, as though reluctant to settle upon a house already burdened with too many unspoken things. The corridors dimmed into amber shadow, lit by lamps that flickered with uncertain patience, and the estate seemed to draw inward upon itself, listening. Outside, the damp earth breathed a quiet scent of rain and leaves, while within, silence stretched between footsteps like a held breath. She had avoided him since the encounter in the sitting room. Not out of fear, she told herself, but from a discipline long practiced, a careful tending of boundaries that had once been broken at too great a cost. Yet avoidance did little to quiet the unrest within her. The coin had not left her thoughts, nor had the way he had spoken, as though testing the edges of memory, as though he stood at the threshold of something both dangerous and inevitable. By the time her duties led her to the rear gardens, dusk had settled into a soft, deceptive calm. The gravel path glistened faintly beneath the last of the light, and the hedges cast long, wavering shapes that seemed almost to shift when one looked too closely. She intended only to pass through. Instead, she found him waiting. He stood near the wrought iron bench at the far edge of the garden, where the estate gave way to open land. The wind stirred lightly about him, catching the edges of his coat, though he himself remained still, too still, as though he had been there for some time. She stopped. For a moment neither moved. Then she inclined her head, the gesture restrained, respectful, and entirely impersonal. "Sir." "Miss," he replied, his voice low, carrying easily across the narrow distance. She did not correct him. "I had hoped," he continued, "that you might come this way." Her gaze lifted, steady now, though something beneath it trembled faintly. "I was not aware my movements were of interest." "They are not," he said, and then, after a brief pause, "to anyone else." The words lingered, weighted with something that pressed uncomfortably against the quiet she had built around herself. She stepped forward, intending to pass him as she had done before, to allow the moment to dissolve into nothing. "Why did you return it?" She halted. "The coin," he clarified. "You might have kept it." Her answer came easily, practiced by years of necessity. "It was not mine to keep." "No," he said softly. "It never was." The reply unsettled her more than she wished to show. She turned then, fully facing him, her composure carefully drawn around her like armor. "If you have summoned me for questions of property, sir, I fear I have little more to offer." "It is not property I seek," he said. There was a shift in his tone, not louder, not harsher, but deeper, as though something long restrained had begun, at last, to surface. "It is truth." The word struck with quiet force. She held his gaze, though the effort cost her. "Truth, sir, is seldom requested of those in my position." "And yet," he said, stepping closer, "it is often carried by them." A silence stretched between them, fragile and charged. "You speak," she said slowly, "as though you know me." "I do." The certainty in his voice left no room for dismissal. Her breath caught, though she forced herself to remain still. "You presume much." "Do I?" he asked, and there was something almost sorrowful in the question. He reached into his coat then, withdrawing the coin once more. It gleamed faintly in the fading light, its worn edges catching what little brightness remained. "Tell me," he said, "where did you first see this?" Her throat tightened. She could refuse. She should refuse. But the past, once stirred, does not easily return to silence. "By the south gate," she said at last, her voice quieter now. "Years ago." "And who gave it to you?" The garden seemed to hold its breath. She closed her eyes briefly, as though the answer required not memory, but courage. "A man who made promises he did not keep." The words fell between them, sharp despite their softness. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, very quietly, "And if I told you those promises were never broken willingly?" Her eyes opened. "No," she said at once, though the refusal lacked conviction. "No, sir." "Do not." "Do not what?" he pressed, his voice still calm, though something within it had begun to strain. "Do not speak of what was taken from us? Do not name what you have buried." "You presume too much," she repeated, though the words faltered now. "I presume nothing," he said. "I remember." The final word landed with undeniable weight. She stepped back, as though distance might restore what composure she had lost. You cannot remember what you did not live. His gaze did not waver. Then allow me to remind you, he said. And before she could stop him, before she could retreat into the safety of silence, he spoke again, his voice lower now, but unmistakably clear. You stood beneath a sky without rain, he said, and you told me that waiting was not a burden so long as it had an end. Her breath caught sharply. You said, he continued, that even time would yield, if one only believed strongly enough. She shook her head, though the motion was small, uncertain. No. And I answered, he said, stepping closer still, that I would return before the first autumn leaf had fallen. The world seemed to tilt. No, she whispered, but the word broke as it left her lips. He stopped before her, close enough now that the years between them felt suddenly, impossibly thin. I did return, he said softly. But not as I had promised. Her eyes searched his face then, not as a servant regards a stranger, but as one who seeks something lost beyond reason. And slowly, painfully, recognition began to take shape. You, she began, but the word would not complete itself. I was sent away, he said, the confession quiet, stripped of pride. Bound by duty, by expectation, by a name that demanded obedience above all else. And so you obeyed, she said, her voice steadier now, though it trembled beneath the surface. Yes, he answered. And in doing so, I lost the only thing that had ever mattered. Silence fell. It was not empty. It was filled, with years, with absence, with everything that had never been said. You expect me to believe, she said at last, that time has preserved what you abandoned? I expect nothing, he replied. I came only to see if it had destroyed it entirely. Her gaze hardened then, the softness giving way to something sharper, more guarded. And has it? He did not answer at once. Instead, he reached out, not to touch her, but to close the distance just enough that his presence alone felt like a question. That, he said quietly, is not mine to decide. For a moment the world narrowed to that single space between them. Then she drew back. You should not have come, she said. Perhaps, he agreed. Her voice faltered just once. Or perhaps you should have come sooner. The words hung there, fragile, irreversible. And in the quiet that followed, something shifted, not resolved, not forgiven, but undeniably awakened. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a breath held for years. I am not the man you knew, he said. No, she replied, her gaze steady despite the storm beneath it. You are not. A pause. Nor, she added softly, am I the woman who waited. The truth of it settled between them, heavy and unyielding. Yet even as she turned to leave, even as she placed distance once more between herself and the past that had found her, his voice followed her, quiet but certain. Then allow me, he said, to learn who you have become. She did not stop, but her steps slowed just slightly. And though she did not turn, though she did not answer, the silence she left behind was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of something that had begun, once more, to live. The ballroom glittered with a brilliance that bordered on excess, as though light itself had been summoned to disguise the cruelty that often thrived beneath such elegance. Chandeliers dripped with crystal fire, scattering reflections across polished floors where silk and satin whispered in graceful arcs. Music swelled, precise and measured, each note reinforcing the illusion that all was as it ought to be. Yet beneath the refinement lingered something sharper. Curiosity sharpened into speculation, and speculation into quiet judgment. She had not expected to be present. Servants did not belong in such rooms except as shadows along the periphery, silent and unnoticed. Yet the mistress of the estate had insisted upon additional hands, citing the importance of the evening, the distinction of their guest. And so she stood among the others near the walls, her presence justified by duty, though her heart beat with an unrest she could neither name nor suppress. He was there. Not hidden, not diminished, but unmistakably central to the gathering. His attire had changed, the modesty of travel replaced by the unmistakable authority of rank. The cut of his coat, the precision of his bearing, the subtle deference shown by those who approached him, these things spoke with a clarity no disguise could withstand. The Duke had returned. Recognition rippled through the room in waves, each whisper adding weight to the revelation. Those who had dismissed him hours before now recalibrated their manners, their smiles sharpened by ambition, their voices softened by calculated respect. And she stood at the edge of it all, the truth pressing heavily against the fragile composure she had fought to maintain. He had not yet looked at her. Or perhaps he had, and she had refused to see it. "Extraordinary, is it not?" a voice murmured beside her. She turned slightly to find one of the younger maids watching the scene with wide, dazzled eyes. "To think he was among us all this time," the girl continued. "And we never knew." Her gaze flickered toward the Duke, then back to the floor. "Some truths," she said quietly, "are not meant to be easily known." The girl did not understand. She only smiled faintly and returned her attention to the spectacle. Across the room, the Duke inclined his head to a noblewoman, his expression composed, his movements effortless. Yet there was something restrained in him still, something held in check beneath the surface of duty and expectation. And then, as though drawn by a force neither of them could resist, his gaze found hers. It was not a glance. It was recognition, open, unguarded, impossible to mistake. The air seemed to shift. She lowered her eyes at once, but the moment had already taken hold. Around them, conversations faltered, subtle at first, then more distinctly as attention turned, as patterns of behavior, long established, rarely questioned, began to fracture under the weight of something unexpected. He moved. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with a purpose that rendered all other motion irrelevant. The crowd parted without understanding why, their instincts yielding to the quiet authority he carried. She felt him before she saw him, the shift in presence, the narrowing of space. "Miss," he said. The single word carried across the hush, formal yet unmistakably directed. She lifted her gaze, though every instinct urged her not to. "My lord," she replied, the title deliberate, placing distance where emotion threatened to close it. A flicker passed through his expression, pain, perhaps, or acknowledgement. "You have served this house faithfully," he said, his voice steady, though the room had grown so quiet that even the faintest tremor would not have escaped notice. "It is my duty," she answered. "And nothing more?" The question lingered, its meaning unfolding in layers. She did not respond. Around them, the silence deepened. He turned then, not away from her, but toward the gathered assembly. His gaze moved across the room, meeting the eyes of those who watched, who listened, who waited. "There are many here," he said, his voice carrying with quiet authority, "who understand the value of appearance." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. "But fewer," he continued, "who recognize the cost at which such appearances are maintained." The word struck with measured precision. He stepped closer to her, though he did not touch her. The space between them remained intact, yet charged with something undeniable. "This woman," he said, his gaze returning to hers, "has been judged by circumstance rather than character." A murmur rose, quickly stifled. "She has been overlooked, dismissed, and, perhaps most unforgivably, forgotten." Each word landed heavier than the last. She felt the weight of every eye upon her. The scrutiny she had avoided for years now turned fully, unrelentingly in her direction. "My lord," she said softly, a warning beneath the formality, "this is neither necessary nor appropriate." "On the contrary," he replied, his voice lowering just enough that the intimacy of it contrasted sharply with the public nature of his words, "it is long overdue." Her breath caught. "I stand before you," he continued, addressing the room once more, "not merely as your duke, but as a man who failed in courage when it was most required." The confession shifted something fundamental. Curiosity gave way to astonishment. "And it is to her," he said, his gaze unwavering now, that I owe that failure. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. She felt it as a physical force, pressing against her, threatening to undo the fragile control she had maintained. You speak of things best left unspoken, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I have left them unspoken for too long, he replied. A pause. Then, more quietly though no less clearly, I will not do so again. The music had ceased entirely. No one moved. No one dared. You were never the one who lacked worth, he said, his voice softening, though its strength did not diminish. It was I who lacked the courage to stand beside you when it mattered. The words hung between them, heavy with truth. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though it carried none the less. Now, he said, I would ask for what I once believed I did not deserve the right to claim. Her heart tightened. And what is that, my lord? His gaze did not waver. You. The simplicity of it rendered it all the more devastating. A murmur surged through the crowd, no longer contained. She felt it, the judgment, the disbelief, the scandal forming in real time. You place me, she said, her voice trembling now despite her effort, in the center of a spectacle I did not seek. I place you, he replied, where you should have stood all along. Tears threatened, but she held them back. Do you imagine, she said, that such words can undo years of silence? No, he answered. But I believe they may begin to answer for them. She shook her head slightly, the motion fragile, uncertain. You ask much. I ask only what remains, he said. The room seemed to lean toward them, every breath suspended, every expectation sharpened. And if nothing remains, she asked. A pause. Then, with quiet certainty, then I shall accept it. The honesty of it struck deeper than any plea. For a moment she could not speak. The past pressed against the present, demanding recognition, demanding resolution. And as she stood there, caught between what had been and what might yet be, she realized with sudden, unsettling clarity. The choice at last was hers. And the world was waiting to see which part of her would answer. The silence did not break at once. It deepened, as though the very walls of the ballroom leaned inward to hear the answer she had not yet given. Faces blurred at the edges of her vision, their curiosity sharp and merciless, yet distant, as if she stood apart from them all, caught in a moment that belonged not to society, but to something far older and far more unforgiving. She could feel her pulse in her throat. He had placed everything before her, not with grandeur alone, but with a vulnerability that no rank could conceal. And still, the weight of years pressed heavily upon her, each memory a quiet argument against the hope that trembled, unbidden, within her chest. You ask for what remains, she said at last, her voice steady despite the storm beneath it. But you forget, my lord, what remains is not untouched. His gaze softened, though he did not look away. I do not forget. I have lived with that knowledge every day. Have you? She replied, and there was no accusation in the words, only a weary truth. Then you understand that what you seek cannot be returned to you as it once was. I do not seek what once was, he said quietly. I seek what may yet be. The distinction lingered between them, fragile and dangerous. Around them, the room held its breath. She lowered her gaze then, not in submission, but in reflection, as though searching within herself for something long obscured. The years rose before her, not in bitterness but in clarity. The long corridors of silence, the quiet endurance, the slow, deliberate shaping of a life built not upon hope, but upon acceptance. And yet, here he stood. Not as the man she had lost, but as the man who had returned. I believed you gone, she said, her voice softer now. Not merely absent. Gone in the way that erases expectation. I know, he answered. I mourned you, she continued. Not openly. Not with the indulgence of grief. But in the quiet places where no one looks. His breath faltered, though he did not interrupt. And when the morning ended, she said, I learned to live without you. The words settled with finality. A lesser man might have stepped back, might have allowed the truth to close the distance between them permanently. But he did not move. "Then you are stronger than I deserved you to be," he said. A faint, almost imperceptible shift touched her expression. "That," she replied, "is not the question before us." "No," he agreed. "It is not." Another silence followed, shorter this time, but no less significant. "What is before us," she said, lifting her gaze once more, "is whether the man who stands before me now understands what it means to choose." His brow furrowed slightly. "Choose?" "Yes," she said. "Not duty. Not expectation. Not the weight of a name that demands obedience. Choice." Something in her voice, firm, unwavering, cut through the last remnants of formality. "For years," she continued, "I believed your silence was your answer. That what we were had been measured and found lacking." "It was never lacking," he said at once. "But it was abandoned," she replied. The truth of it struck with quiet precision. He did not deny it. "I cannot undo that," he said. "I cannot return what was lost. But I can stand here now and choose differently." She studied him then. Not the Duke, not the figure of authority that commanded the room, but the man who had stepped forward, stripped of certainty, offering something that could not be reclaimed if refused. "And if I refuse you?" she asked. The question carried no cruelty. Only honesty. His answer came without hesitation. "Then I will accept it," he said. "And I will carry that refusal as I have carried all else, with the knowledge that I earned it." A murmur stirred faintly among the onlookers, but neither of them turned. She exhaled slowly, as though releasing something she had held for years. "You have changed," she said. "So have you," he replied. A faint, almost reluctant smile touched her lips, though it faded as quickly as it came. "Yes," she said. "I have." The admission lingered between them. Then, after a pause that felt both brief and endless, she stepped forward. It was a small movement, barely more than a shift in distance. Yet it altered everything. "You ask for what may yet be," she said quietly. "I do. And you offer it not as obligation, but as choice?" "Yes." She held his gaze, searching it not for perfection, but for truth. At last she spoke again. "Then understand this, my lord," she said, her voice steady, clear. "If I step toward you now, it will not be as the woman I once was. It will not be with blind faith, nor with the innocence that time has taken." "I would not ask it of you," he said. "No," she replied softly. "You would not." Another breath, another moment, and then, "I will not return to what was," she said. "But I will not deny what still remains." The words were neither surrender nor rejection. They were something far more difficult. They were acceptance. A shift passed through him, subtle but unmistakable. "Then," he said, his voice lower now, almost reverent, "may I stand beside you?" She regarded him for a long moment. Then, with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any declaration, she inclined her head. "You may," she said. The room seemed to exhale. Whispers surged, astonishment mingling with disbelief, yet none of it touched the space they now occupied. For the first time, he allowed himself to reach for her, not with urgency, not with claim, but with care. His hand found hers. She did not withdraw. The contact was light, almost tentative, yet it carried the quiet force of something restored, not as it had been, but as it had chosen to become. Around them, the world resumed its motion, though altered, though marked by what had just transpired. But within that moment, within that fragile and hard-won stillness, there was something that neither time nor society could entirely diminish. Not innocence, not certainty, but something steadier, something earned. And as the chandeliers cast their light upon them both, no longer divided by distance or disguise, the past did not vanish. It settled, not as a wound, but as a foundation upon which something new, and far more enduring, might finally begin.